Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of People Management Digest. My name is Lucas Pesa, and today I'm actually really excited to bring this conversation to you guys. We got a really good topic that we're going to be discussing. It's going to be about inclusion in the workforce, inclusivity in the workforce, how organizations can better understand it, how organizations can better communicate in order to build more inclusive workforces, and a lot of other great related topics. We got a great person to help us understand the nuances of this conversation and provides a really great perspective. We brought on Colin Druhen for this episode. He's the executive director at Pride at Work Canada, and he's got a lot of great perspectives. Actually founded in 2008, Pride at Work Canada serves to improve the climate of inclusiveness for LGBT in the Canadian workforce. Pride at Work Canada also empowers employers to foster real cultures that recognize all employees as an important part of an effective workforce. They work to help Canadian employers create safer, obviously more inclusive workspaces, realize the full potential of their staff, and bring down barriers to employment. So there were a lot of great subject matter sort of points that we brought up throughout the course of the conversation. I'm really excited that we get to bring it to you guys. We talked about health and benefits. We talked about the importance, obviously, of communication in the workforce and how this all ties into the broader conversation of inclusion in the workforce and how organizations can really not only work to create more inclusive workforces, but how to communicate effectively in order to do that. So I think this is a really great conversation, and it's an important one to be had. So make sure that you check out the whole thing. There's a lot of great points that Colin brings up. And yeah, I won't take up any more time. So enjoy the podcast. Hi, everyone, and welcome to the podcast. Today I've got Colin Druhen. Colin, how you doing?
Good, thanks. Thanks for having me.
No problem at all. So obviously the conversation that we're going to be having is in regards to inclusion and how organizations can not only be more inclusive, but use inclusion as a force to create a more innovative workforce in that regard. But one thing that I find organizations really are challenged by is how to define inclusion and set targets for inclusion. Obviously, there's a lot going on in around the world right now where organizations are really trying to make an effort to create a more inclusive workforce, create a more inclusive society, and they're trying to use that as part of their business model. One thing I wanted to ask you about, in terms of defining inclusion and setting targets for it in 2018, how would you recommend companies go about doing that?
Well, I think the thinking in the past has always been around representation, and that's when the conversation focused more on diversity. But it's good to hear you use the word inclusion so much because it's easy to just look at levels of folks from marginalized communities and how they're represented in a workforce. But in the LGBTQ space, we tend to focus on the amount of people who are out at work. Over half of LGBTQ people in Canada are not actually out to everyone they work with. So thinking about what that means for somebody who's gay or bi or trans or otherwise gender diverse, it really just means that there's a lot of people who are in jobs where they don't talk about who they are. They don't talk about their relationships. They don't talk about their spouses. They don't mention their kids. They don't talk about their families. And you think about how many times a day one might kind of casually mention something that they did with their spouse or a milestone in one of their kids' lives or something that's going on personally. You can start to realize how isolated some people must feel when they're not out at work. But the best ways of measuring inclusion in this space is really to look at a lot of different data and how it all relates to one another. So looking at how many people identify as members of the LGBTQ community, looking at if there's more representation in some departments or business areas than others, and if so, what are the differences? Is it management? Is it the type of training that's being offered? And isolating what those differences might be to see why some folks might gravitate more towards some areas than others. And then thinking of the people who identify as members of the community, how many of them report being out to their colleagues, and what's the income of LGBTQ people compared to other people in the workplace? So, looking at things like salary data and employee satisfaction data are just as important as the sheer numbers of a marginalized group and how they're represented. I think the big problem in this case is that a lot of employers either don't want to or they don't think they can collect information about sexual orientation, but they can, and they absolutely should, so that they can start measuring some of these efforts. And similarly, the way that we collect gender data is, for the most part, really outdated, and it's not reflective of the way that people are realistically thinking about gender identity right now. So a lot of the way that we collect information about how people identify their gender it's really not keeping up. So it's important to take a look at how those processes impact the measurement efforts that you have when it comes to diversity inclusion, at least in this space.
Absolutely, yeah, and you touched on something as it pertained to the whole dynamic of inclusion in the workplace, and one thing that spoke to me a lot is how communication plays a huge role in creating an inclusive workforce, and in terms of not only empowering people to identify or anything like that, but knowing the data to collect, being able to communicate with people in terms of the whether it's the sort of salary thing that you were referring to, or making sure that proper mentorship's being applied to all members of the workforce. So I guess one thing I'm curious to know, just to sort of build on that a little bit, is how can organizations sort of balance the conversation a little bit? Because obviously when it comes to, communication and specifically as it pertains to inclusion, organizations want to be as inclusive as possible to make sure not only that, everybody feels included in the workforce, but so that more ideas and perspectives are included when putting together sort of business plans, and when they're, essentially enabling people to create an opportunity to contribute to the company's work or the organization's work. What are some ways? Do you think there are any particular strategies that companies can use as it specifically pertains to communication to enable that kind of inclusivity and innovation?
Well, I think when it comes to communication, you kind of have to think about the ways that different groups might access things like benefits, and figuring out ways of making sure that everybody knows that any kind of health insurance or other kind of benefits that are offered apply to everyone. And it's important to remember that people access these things in different ways. Yeah. Thinking about the LGBTQ community, there's a real need for mental health and wellness supports, in the community. So making sure people know what's accessible in that area is really important. I think, thinking too about families and any kind of benefits around parental leave or healthcare for dependents. When you look at when same-gender marriage was legalized in Canada, in the 2001 census, that was before that happened, and we saw probably about 4,500 kids living with parents who were of the same gender who are in a relationship. But then 10 years later, after same-gender marriage had been legalized, you see double that amount of kids living with parents who are of the same gender in a relationship. So obviously, that's defying a lot of people's stereotypes about, in particular, people who are lesbian, gay, or bi having kids. So if your organization's benefits around parental leave aren't specific about making sure that people understand what's offered when both parents are the same gender, or if the language is, just not reflective of all the different types of relationships that you might find in society, you're really not fulfilling your obligation to giving equal access to those benefits. And if the people who administrate the benefits aren't actually coached or trained on the proper way of speaking about how benefits apply to LGBT people, if the coverage that you have is insufficient, if it doesn't cover any, transition-related costs for people who might want to transition while they're on the job, or, people who require other medical supports because of conditions such as HIV and AIDS, if there's certain things that are really important to members of the LGBT community because there's certain healthcare needs that are disproportionately felt within the community. So just making sure that people understand those facts and understand how to communicate, how to access the coverage is just one of those examples of making sure that there's effective communication so that everybody's kind of getting an equal shake at things within the workplace.
Exactly, yeah. And so obviously we just spoke a little bit at length about communication and the impact and the importance of it in the workplace and how it ties into this whole conversation of inclusion and all that. Just to sort of, ask a related question, and you touched on this a little bit in regards to sort of health and benefits and even communication. But in terms of the common challenges that organizations face when it comes to establishing a strong culture of inclusion, what are some of the barriers that they sometimes face, and what are the sort of most effective strategies to face them? I mean, obviously we spoke a little bit just now about communication and whether it's through health and benefits and making sure that the proper opportunity is allowed so that everyone feels included in the workforce and so that proper ideas and perspectives can be, allowed to and enabled to contribute to the organization. What are some of the main challenges organizations face when they're trying to create a more inclusive culture? And what are some strategies that you think can help them, attack those challenges?
Well, I think a lot of employers, just don't really know where to start, and
Right.
then they look around, and they sometimes start on a path that's informed by stereotypes and assumptions,
Sure.
Which really just kind of doesn't really help things very much.
Right.
If you're a person who isn't aware of any LGBTQ folks in your workplace, nobody's out at work, and you don't necessarily have any contact with any organizations that serve the community. You might be a bit confused about where to start, but
Yeah.
obviously one of the most visible celebrations in the community is Pride, and a lot of people kind of turn to Pride events as kind of a starting point.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's great. Pride is a celebration of how far the community's come and some of the challenges we need to continuously face. But LGBTQ people face challenges year round. It's not just at Pride.
Yeah.
So it's really important to kind of talk to people about what their specific challenges are and what steps they might recommend to address those challenges, rather than just make assumptions about what people want based on things that you might see on TV or in movies, or what other companies are doing.
Mm-hmm.
It's equally important to kind of understand what systemic barriers people might face, and the way that you're going to find out about those things is actually engaging with the community directly and asking employees directly what types of things are barriers for them on a day-to-day basis, and talking to the community outside of your workplace to find out, what are some of the barriers people are facing when it comes to accessing employment in the community, and what are some of the steps that you can take to bring down those barriers. I would say another big challenge or issue is the kind of disproportionate focus that a lot of employers have on sexual orientation, and completely leaving gender identity and gender expression out of their LGBTQ inclusion strategy. So, one of the reasons for this is that, we've definitely seen a lot of movement over the last number of decades around people who are gay or bi kind of getting more access to, positions in senior leadership, or becoming more visible in popular culture or the community. And a lot of folks are therefore kind of coming out at work and leading, volunteer efforts through employee resource groups or other types of diversity councils. They're leading from their own experience as a cisgender person who's lesbian, gay, or bi. And that's wonderful, but they're leading a lot of these efforts from their own personal experience. So if you don't have representation from people who are trans or non-binary or genderqueer or otherwise gender diverse, you're not really getting the whole picture of the challenges that are facing the community. So it's kind of time to start looking at all of the identities that make up the community that we're talking about here, and making sure that if you don't have representation, or even if you do, it's important to get perspectives from outside of the organization to find out, you only know what you know from who's around the table. So if you have certain lack of representation of certain people around the table, you have to go seek out advice from people outside the organization who are going to tell you what you need to do to improve. So it's important to listen to who you have under your roof, but it's also important to kind of look outside sometimes and see who else might want to help improve the workplace.
Yeah, absolutely. And one question that I think, is important to ask, because obviously, when it comes to this entire conversation, obviously creating an inclusive workforce, enabling perspectives into the room, enabling people to feel, as a part of the organization as possible, having effective communication strategies. These are all things that companies, are trying to figure out in terms of how they implement them and how they have these conversations and how they enable the communication necessary to really achieve the kind of inclusion that they'd like to. But one thing, and this isn't necessarily just, in relation to inclusion, this is sort of just more of a business ended question. And I think, inclusion is a big part of this question as well. But when organizations are trying to create a more inclusive workforce, does having a more inclusive workforce actually enable higher profitability? Does it engage people more to the point where the company is more innovative or more productive? Is there some sort of quantifiable, I guess, ROI from a business standpoint that companies should be aware of when they're starting to really think about how they implement inclusion into their workforce?
Well, how your efforts, you kind of stack up, you can kind of look at it two ways. How it's contributing to a healthy and productive workforce on one hand, and then how you're responding to the needs of the market on the other hand. So, people who are constantly covering and hiding who they are in the workplace are less productive. Similarly, if someone doesn't understand, like I said previously, how benefits like health insurance can be accessed, or if the coverage that's offered doesn't meet their needs, they're clearly not getting the same benefits as other employees. So they're not being afforded equal opportunity in that sense. It's been well documented that when people feel supported at work, they're more productive.
Right.
And when you train people to understand the expectations of appropriate behavior, you're taking less time away from work to handle, harassment complaints, issues around discrimination, and those kind of social issues that might impede productivity. If you have a group of employees who, because of their behavior, can't work together effectively, how are they supposed to solve problems together? And how are they supposed to produce for the organization? So that's one hand. The other hand is that if you have a diverse workforce where people feel comfortable bringing their ideas to the table, you're in a much better position to respond to the needs of an increasingly diverse market. Diverse and inclusive environments support creative thinking, and creative thinking is what is going to help meet those challenges.
Absolutely, yeah. No, those are all really great points. Colin, I appreciate you taking the time to chat with us today. I think we've gotten off on a really good tear of thought here, and you've obviously got a lot of great insights. For those who want to continue the conversation, if you want to connect with Colin, the Executive Director at Pride at Work Canada, you can reach out through Pride at Work Canada. Make sure you give them a follow on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. You can also check them out on their website through prideatwork.ca. And if you want to follow us at Great Place to Work Canada, obviously you can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn, and through our website at greatplacetowork.ca. And keeping with the theme of the podcast as it pertains to inclusion and making sure that organizations are creating as inclusive a workforce as possible, Great Place to Work Canada actually recently released its best workplaces for inclusion list. So lots of great companies on there. So make sure you check out that recent list and make sure you check that out. And for those interested in gaining some CPD credits towards your CHRP designation, the Great Place to Work Canada conference returns to Toronto April 25th. So make sure you check that out again through our website. Colin, I appreciate you taking the time to chat with us today about inclusion. I think this is a really important conversation that's becoming more and more prevalent as the years go by, not only in the workforce, but just in popular culture. I definitely see, a lot of shifts that, that are bringing this conversation to the forefront of people's attention more and more. So I appreciate you taking the time to chat with us a bit today.
Great. Thanks again for having me here.